Okay, so History of the Bible, Part 3. We are in the home stretch. We're only in the 17th century in the story, but we're bringing it up to the modern, right? To the modern translations, the NIV and the ESV and the NASB and all the acronyms. So we will be finding out how we got from where we left off, which was the King James Bible, right, in 1611, and then its acceptance, and then, of course, I took some time to do some conversation about the King James only controversy. So we're going to pick it up from there and continue. And we had mentioned before that there are no new major translations for well nigh 400 years, right? But that doesn't mean there wasn't work being done. Just because there weren't new translations in English, of course there are new translations happening throughout this time period in different languages, right? In other languages, languages that didn't have the scriptures before in their language and whatnot. But we're continuing to focus on the English Bible and English scholarship. The first one to talk about then is Brian Walton in 1657. This is very similar to what Cardinal Jimenez did when Erasmus was coming out with his translation. You see, we have different versions. We've got Hebrew, Greek, Samaritan, Arabic, Syriac, and so he's doing that same kind of deep scholarship of looking at the different languages, the early translation of the scriptures, in order to deepen our understanding and knowledge of what we have in the Greek, right? And so one thing that he did was consult Codex Alexandrinus, and we talked about that way back, one of the earliest nearly complete scriptures, and the Royal Library in England had come into possession of it. He put the variant readings in the margins. And so he's doing some scholarship work, right? He's doing some study, and he's putting in the margins the variant readings from a new codice, from a new manuscript that had not been seen and studied before. Now, right away, in 1657, right, 46 years after the King James Bible is published, you have people complaining that this work is threatening the authority of Scripture by talking about variants. So that is not a new conversation that's being had in our postmodern world. That's something they were saying to Brian Walton way back then. It wasn't true then, and it's not true now. The truth of the story and the truth of the evidence is what we want. So there's one step in the process. And then you have John Mills, who publishes a Greek New Testament in 1707. And what he did was not study manuscripts, but he critically analyzed all of the printed editions of the Greek New Testament from Erasmus up until his time. All right, and then with that, he brought in early versions of Syriac and Coptic and Armenian, et cetera, et cetera. 32 different printed editions of the Greek New Testament he analyzed for his work. Okay, these are people that are putting in decades of their lives at time. Took him 30 years, and it says he finished just 2 weeks before his death. I have no idea what the connection between finishing and dying was, if he was dying and so he had to hurry to finish. I didn't dig that far into it, but my goodness. One of the things he did was talk about the canon, and we talked about that in our Q&A at the end last week, right? Why these books and not those, why this but not that. And also, how do we evaluate manuscripts? People were starting to ask the question, here's one from that seems pretty ancient, and here's another one that's ancient. How do we know which one is more accurate? How do we understand that and have that conversation and that analysis? So that work is advancing, and people are talking about that and studying that and thinking about that. One of the big steps forward begins with Constantine von Tischendorf. And we talked about him and the finding of Codex Sinaiticus. We talked about him and the decoding of the Ephraimi palimpsest, the one that had the two right on top of each other. That's the same guy. But in 1869, he published a critical analysis that to this day has some of the ideas about textual criticism that scholars are using in order to evaluate different readings, in order to talk about the original text and how we understand it. And of course, he brought Codex Sinaiticus into the conversation by going out there and rescuing it in his version of the story. One of the reasons that, and I didn't mention this when we were talking about him way back when we were talking about Codex Sinaiticus, one of the reasons we know that his story about them burning the first 5 books as fire starters, why we know it's bunk, is because they actually found them later. They had become detached from the book, from the binding, and had become separated. There was a walled-off room. You got to have an old building when you have a walled-off room that nobody knows is there. They were doing some remodeling at St. Catherine's in the Sinai, and they found most of those pages, plus a bunch of other things. So whether von Tischendorf, believed that or made that up, it was covering his tracks. It's a fascinating story. He's an Indiana Jones kind of type guy, but he's advancing this work. And then we have Westcott and Hort. And this is going to be a big step forward in the path between Erasmus's text, right? Because that's still what the only prominent translation in English is the King James at this point in history. It used Erasmus's text that was available then in the 17th century. This is going to be a step forward towards a modern text. And so you will see, if you go on King James only websites, Westcott and Hort ripped apart. People will call them heretics and non-believers and all sorts of stuff, which of course has nothing to do with their actual discipleship. Because they developed the history of the early transmission of the New Testament text. They asked themselves, how did this manuscript that we have relate to this one? Is this one's older than this one, right? That one led to that one. And tried to make that spider web. Remember when we had the chart way back when of how a variant could creep into it? They tried to begin to piece that back together. Again, remember that we're missing most of the pieces in that because they haven't survived. We've got one here and here and here, and so Westcott and Hort are beginning to try to sort that out. How do these relate to each other? How do we know what the older ones are? And hopefully by older, more reliable. That's the theory, right? That's the thought, which is largely borne out in most cases, that the closer it is to the time of the apostles, the more likely it is to be as close to 100% as we can get. And so what they came up with was something called manuscript families. And I didn't talk about that a lot in this seminar because it's a fairly controversial topic and there's a lot of scholarship going back and forth about it. Basically, Westcott and Hort posited this thesis that there was a manuscript, say, for the Gospel of Mark, right? Gospel of Mark gets written, and one copy ends up in Alexandria, and one in Syria, and one in Corinth, and one in Rome, for example. We'll just simplify it and say there were 4. Over time, the copies that came from those 4 second-generation copies are what we call a manuscript family, because they're related to the one that they came from. And their variants, their errors, right, are connected to each other. And they're different than the ones from a family that they're not, because they're not interrelated. They're being copied in their own stream, kind of like different, like a river that branches out into 4 different streams that flow apart for a while, kind of thing. And so they posited that, and there's a lot of thought about that. It has some interesting pros and cons, and there's some definite evidence and some definite questions about it. But by this point in history, in the 19th century, most of the scholars that were studying the text of the Scriptures had concluded that Erasmus and Stephanus and the Textus Receptus and all that work that Erasmus had done, while great, was not the authentic New Testament text. We could do better. And the question was, how much better, and what do we do with it? right? At this point, nobody's coming up with a new translation. Nobody's changing the King James. So this is mostly an academic conversation because nobody is actually putting a scripture out there that says we've made some changes, this word here and that phrase there, because now we know that the manuscript evidence says that that's the original reading. We haven't gotten that far yet, but the scholars in America and Europe and elsewhere are realizing that that point is coming, that we could do that and make the text more accurate. I was going to say the word improve. That has a bad connotation to it, perhaps. More accurate is what we want. We want as close to what Paul and Matthew and John and Luke and all of them wrote as possible. So those are the people in this era, the 17th, 18th, 19th century, doing this scholarship work. It's happening generation after generation. People are studying these things and gaining understanding as more manuscripts are uncovered. This is the period where we start to find, as I said, Vaticanus and Sinaiticus and Alexandrinus and all of these manuscripts that were lost to history for 1700 years, depending on how old each of them were. This chart's not bad. I found this one online, and it has a good visual feel to it. And so I want to point out a few things. We've got the original manuscripts way back here, right? And those are not part of our conversation all the way through the King James Bible. The Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, Alexandrinus, because they're lost. They're not part of the scholarship conversation that Erasmus had. He didn't look at them, he didn't study them, he didn't have that in his arsenal. Of course, he was also rushing to get it to publishing. And so when we're talking, we've got the Vulgate's part of the conversation, because of course Erasmus studied Jerome's Latin. That was part of his original publication. The Masoretic text, that would be what the Jewish diaspora in Europe had copied down. Those are the ones that we found match up with the Dead Sea Scrolls. And then we had Wycliffe, Tyndale, et cetera, et cetera. They're all part of that same stream based largely on Erasmus's work. And eventually, of course, we'll find the Dead Sea Scrolls as well. The modern translations at the top are part of this, like everyone else, but also this. And so that brings us to this chart that I want to spend some time on. I gave you guys a copy of it. This one I made along with Pastor Scott Woodley, who used to serve here in Franklin at the Alliance Church, a good friend of mine. He helped with, I drew this on a piece of paper in my penmanship, and he turned it into something that looks nice. So I appreciate it, and added a few of his own tidbits to it to sort of round it out. So this one goes from the top down. So we flipped that from the last one. So at the very top, we've got the original New Testament autographs, right? By that we mean, remember, the ones from the hand of the original author. Okay? Copies were made of that. We got 4 different fonts to remind us that the copies are not exactly the same, very much closely the same, but they're different handmade copies coming from that. And those get spread out, which is why it says Byzantine, Alexandrian, Western, because those are geographic locations where those copies ended up. All right, those are those families that Westcott and Hort were talking about. Off to the side, we've got the church fathers at the top right. Those are the theologians and the bishops and the ministers of the early church that are writing about the text of Scripture and, of course, quoting it. And their quotations are helpful to us because they at least let us know what they thought of the text when they had it in front of them, right? When they quoted Romans, what did it look like? And so that's helpful. But that won't come back into the conversation all the way to John Mills in 1707. He was the first one to bring the church fathers' quotations back into the conversation and say, does that help us understand this? You also have these other languages, Syriac and Coptic and Armenian. Those are the main ones. There's some others as well. They will come back into the conversation with John Mills, not part of the conversation that Erasmus was having. In the middle, we've got our Latin stream. We've got the Vulgate, which Wycliffe used for his translation into English, which Gutenberg used for his Bible, and that became the Douay-Rheims translation, came from the Latin. It's right here in the middle. And the New American Bible, which is basically the Catholic Bible, is based on Jerome's Latin through a series of steps, but from that same stream kind of in the middle of the conversation. And then we've got these manuscripts that are lost to history for 1,500 years until von Tischendorf and Westcott and Hort are able to study them and bring them back in and use them. So off on the left, we have the King James stream. That's primarily from Byzantine text. The texts that Erasmus had were ones that originated from the Byzantine Empire, from Constantinople and that surrounding area. So they have Western readings, Eastern readings in that respect. And so you have Erasmus and Tyndale and the Geneva Bible and the King James Bible all using that same, and that comes all the way to the present because the New King James Bible is using that same Greek basis as the original King James Bible. The only difference between the New King James and the King James, the only significant difference, is the wording. They've updated the language, but they didn't change the Greek basis in the New Testament. Okay? You with me on that? You get me there? So we've got one conversation over here. We've got a middle one in Latin, and then everybody else is part of this conversation here. And we'll get to those, to the rest of that story in a minute, but that's where we're about to get to, talking about the eclectic text, and all of the modern translations coming out in the 20th century are going to bring together those different streams for the first time since they were separated in the early church. Put it one other way. Any questions on this chart? Some people are visual learners, and looking at a chart will help put together a whole bunch of words that I've been talking about. Maybe that helps. Yeah?
We're trying to remember. I think we talked about it.
Maybe I am too.
But on the left-hand side,
yep.
Over halfway down when it starts with Erasmus.
Mm-hmm.
So like the original autographs were already Greek, but then he just developed a printed version.
Yes. So Erasmus's is a printed version. He wasn't making new hand copies. He was taking them, collating them. He had 7 or 8 of them, looked at them in front of him, and came up with what he thought the right reading was based on those. They didn't always agree with each other. Not 90-some odd percent of the time, 98, 99% of the time they did, but every once in a while they didn't. And I mentioned those 2 verses, those 2 little passages where he didn't have any Greek, and so he had to take it from Jerome, from the Latin. So he is putting a printed edition of the Greek together. And from here on down, we're talking about printed editions, except for when we're studying those old ones. Nobody's making new ones anymore after the printing press, because that doesn't make any sense. Absolutely.
Did they stay Greek?
Yes. So all of this conversation about the New Testament, whether it's the King James or the modern text, are still talking about Greek in the New Testament. We're bringing into the conversation what the Syriac and the Coptic and the Armenian said, because it helps us understand sometimes a variant. Say, for example, we've got a verse, and there's 2 different variants in the manuscript tradition. Maybe it feels really strongly that this is the original. There's more older manuscripts. It's more. It makes more sense. It fits. And so they say, okay, is there any other evidence that helps us understand that? Well, in the Syriac from the 4th century, we have a manuscript or whatever that says that if we understand the translation from Greek to Syriac, right, if we got to do it, that's a whole other level of knowledge, it would back up that reading. Or maybe the Coptic goes with the variant that we didn't really we weren't sure about. And so it adds, so it's like adding small weights to the scales of trying to figure out what the original text is, right? The church fathers, the other languages, the Latin, they're all pieces of evidence They're not as heavy as the Greek manuscripts are, and that makes sense. But they can help further the conversation, help people understand that. So this is sort of the manuscript tradition and the flow of thought at a glance for the last 2,000 years. And hopefully that helps a little bit with giving it some visualization. And then I have one more chart, and then we're going to talk about the modern text and what it is. This is a different way of visualizing it. In the middle of the chart, we have the original autograph, what came from the pen of the apostles, right? It doesn't exist anymore because, of course, none of those original autographs exist. And no modern or no existing manuscript, to our knowledge, is 100% exactly every letter that they wrote, right? You could be 99.9% in your copying skills, and you got one word that you made a plural as a copyist, that it was a singular. You've made a mistake. They all have some mistakes in them. So we have that ideal, and that is what we are searching for. Over time, we are likely to diverge from it in increasing amounts when we're talking about handmade copies. Okay? We don't have the earliest copies, the first century and a half, right? They have not survived. But we have some, interestingly, in the story that are very old, that were out of the conversation for 1,500 years or more. Alexandrinus, Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, and these papyri that have been rediscovered, they are, and scholarship will back it up, and it makes perfect sense logically, closer in almost all, and 9 times out of 10, they are closer to the original than things that we have that come later. Because there are less generations of copies between them and the original. Maybe there's only 2 generations between them and the original, as opposed to these from the 5th century, the 6th century that we have, that maybe have 6 generations or so of copies between them and the original. So the question is, how big is this gap, and what does it represent? Okay? And that's what we're gonna focus back in on. We started there in the very beginning when we talked about the accuracy, when we talked about Bart Ehrman saying that no significant theological thing that we're supposed to believe has been affected by this. We're circling back around now that we've seen the whole story, now that we know how all of this works to an extent, and asking ourselves, how close to this are we? And what is our confidence in all of that? So let's talk about this. There's a lot more text here. My apologies. This is as concise as I could make it. So with new manuscripts, we've got Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, Alexandrinus, and a bunch of other ones that have letters and symbols being rediscovered with the work of Tischendorf and Westcott and Hort and all of these other guys, understanding the history of the text. A new critical, and critical doesn't mean criticizing, it means studied, analyzed, critical text of the New Testament emerged that wasn't exclusively Byzantine. It wasn't just like the Textus Receptus and Erasmus. It wasn't from just that one stream that came out of Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire. And it wasn't just Western, coming out of the tradition of Jerome and the Latin Vulgate. And it wasn't just Alexandrian, based on those manuscripts that were hidden in the desert for 1,500 years. But, and this is, I bolded it and made it bigger and underlined it because this is a huge, key, important thought. A combination of the best readings from all sources. So the modern scholar's goal is to give us the best reading from whatever source. If it's Western, great. If it's Byzantine, great. If it's Alexandrian, great. Whichever one has the most accurate, the best reading, that's the one we want. And we're also, of course, bringing in the church fathers, the early translations, to fill in this conversation. And so a modern critical text contains a scholarly apparatus, and I'll show you what it looks like in a second, which footnotes the major textual variations with specific identification of particular ancient manuscripts. Let me find a good page that's got a lot of them. This is my Novum Testamentum Graece. It's my Greek New Testament. All right, this is a fairly cheap one. It's small. You've got the Greek text, and you've got the little things telling you where the variants are, and then here at the bottom, what you have is what the variant is, and then a listing of different manuscripts. Here's a variant. That's what we believe the text is. Here's the variant, and and next to that will be it's in Alexandrinus, and this one, and this one, and this one, and now you can think about it. So if you are a scholar, if you are someone who knows Greek, that would be helpful. You're not getting very far without it in this endeavor. You can look up these. And frankly, you can do this with Google, even if you don't know Greek. You could, if you came across in your study Bible a footnote that says, or this, right? And it might say some manuscripts, late manuscripts, a few manuscripts, right? Those are the kinds of things the footnotes say. You could Google that verse and ask manuscript evidence, variant reading, Luke 6:12, right? I just picked a random verse. And find out what's going on there. And it's not that hard to understand. Oftentimes, the explanation is fairly simple, but this exists for the entire New Testament now. And of course, it is being updated with every new edition of this because new manuscripts are being analyzed and cataloged and their variant readings put into it. And so it's an ever increasing amount of accuracy and scholarship that allows us to contemplate those variants. So let's talk about what that is. What is this eclectic? And that's a great word in critical text in the New Testament. One of the organizations chiefly responsible for it is the Institute for New Testament Textual Research, which is an interesting acronym, the INTTR, at the University of Münster in Germany. Beginning in 1959, they started a project on the history of the New Testament to reconstruct the initial Greek text on the basis of all of this. They're the ones that publish this, all right, that are behind these Greek New Testaments. And they did all of that work. One of the leading men behind it is a man named Kurt Aland, and later his wife Barbara supervised the project. And they started documenting all of these manuscripts and documenting all of these variants so that they could go into this and you would know exactly how many of those 5,800 manuscripts contain the variant that isn't in the text, of course, because in the bottom is the readings that aren't in the text, the ones that are secondary. They don't think they're the original, but they think it's important enough that you can study that. So the Greek text, which underlines most modern translations, of course everything but the New King James Version, is published either by the United Bible Society, you may have heard of them, and that's the Greek New Testament 5th edition. I didn't look to see if this is 5th edition or 4th edition. This one's pretty old. It would be 4th edition because that was 2014. So UBS, or the Nestle-Aland New Testament Greek, 28th edition. They're the same text. There's two different publishings of it. One of them has more scholarly material in the margins than the other, is the basics between the two of them. So this work is ongoing. The last editions were published in 2014 and 2012. New ones will come out at some point here, and of course people that work at seminaries and research places will have to buy a new edition because the new ones come out that has the work, the scholarship of the last 10, 15 years before since the last one included in it now. It's an ever ongoing thing. And one other group that I wanted to talk to you guys about, and this wasn't in my previous editions of this seminar, is the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts. Daniel Wallace is a brilliant man. If you ever watch anything on the text of the Bible by Daniel Wallace, he's got lots of different YouTube videos. It's very academic, but he absolutely knows his stuff. Starting in 2002, because technology made it possible, they started digitally photographing every extant means still existing, Greek New Testament manuscript that they could get their hands on. And so over the last couple of decades, they have gone to four continents and 40 different institutes to digitally photograph these manuscripts, so that 1,000 years from now, if someone wants to know about a 4th century manuscript, it still exists, even if the actual manuscript doesn't exist anymore, because a high-resolution digital photograph is the same thing. And in doing so, they have found dozens of these manuscripts that will eventually find their way into the critical apparatus that nobody had cataloged before. You know, some monastery, some library, some rich dude's, collection in some castle in Europe, they found, oh, here's another manuscript, and they're looking. What, this one's not cataloged. Who knows? Okay, and so now we got to try to figure out what this one is. Photograph the entire thing, and then somebody's going to have to sit down and study it, which of course, fun work. If you're into languages, I'm sure. But so again, one of the things I'm trying to stress here is this is ongoing work year after year. Eventually, they will have digitally photographed every extant Greek manuscript. It's going to take a while because there are 5,800 of them, and some of them are very brittle and have to be handled with extreme museum-level caution, right, with the gloves and the right environment, and so photographing a page takes quite a while. So they're going to be on this for decades, but that work will continue. Which leads us to this question. How different are the Greek texts, right? How different is Erasmus from the majority, from the modern? And so I got to bring in a new term that we haven't talked about much, and that is the majority text. Now, the majority text is not a printed text. There is no, it's not what we're talking about. It's basically just saying, let's do a head count. Right? John chapter 1, verse 1, the first word, what is it? And everybody put what their answer is from all 5,800 manuscripts. Of course, they're not all the Gospel of John, but however many are John that have that verse, and let's add them up. Whoever has the most, that's the majority. Now, oftentimes, almost all the time, the majority is correct, because almost all the time the text is correct that we have. The majority differs from the Textus Receptus, from Erasmus's 8 copies that he used, 2,000 times. Now again, 2,000 times seems like a lot, but that's 99% the same. So even though Erasmus, and this is fascinating stuff, even though Erasmus only had 7 or 8 manuscripts, and most of them were medieval or more recent, right? He didn't have anything from the 3rd century, the 4th century, the 5th century. He didn't have anything from Alexandria. He didn't have anything. He didn't have any of that. Even though he didn't have that, his text still agrees with the majority 99% of the time. So 1% of the time, the question is he's not in the majority. So the King James isn't in the majority because it's based on him. That doesn't mean you're wrong because you're not in the majority, but that's how similar these are. The Nestle-Aland text, or the UBS text that I was talking about here, which brings all of that other stuff in, right? All of the church fathers and the Syriac and the Armenian and the Coptic and all of that stuff, all of the new discoveries from the desert, right? When you bring all of that in and throw that into the mix, it agrees with the majority 98% of the time. So we're talking about the 2%, right? We're talking about the 2% of the time that the majority disagrees with the modern text. And of course, the reasons for that vary. Sometimes it disagrees, but the evidence is very strong that the original, which of course Nestle-Aland, they wouldn't put it in their reading if they didn't believe that it was the original reading. But it will note, of course, that that's not the majority. But again, we're talking about 2% or less of the time. Most of the disagreements in the Greek text, whether we're talking majority, Textus Receptus, or the modern, don't affect the translation of the Greek into English. We talked about that previously. Their spelling, the and thing, that kind of stuff. And so we come all the way back around to our conversation about the variance to this quote, and this is from someone who wrote a book on the New King James and the King James. So he's not someone biased towards the modern translations, right? If your specialty is the King James, Bible readers may be assured that the most important differences in English New Testament of today are due not to manuscript divergence, but to the way in which translators view the task of translation. In other words, how literal should the text be rendered? In other words, if you're looking at a difference between a King James and an NIV and an ESV and an NASB, the majority of the time, the vast majority of the time, the difference is not the Greek text, but the translator's decisions. How to take Greek into English. All right? And we'll finish focusing on that thought. The rest of our time is going to be looking largely at that conversation. All right? Every once in a while, there's a significant variant where the Greek text is different, and that makes a difference. But most of the time, it's the translator's choices that are showing you the difference. Does that make sense? Because English is a big language. You've got choices, right? When you're looking at a Greek word. So what are the modern translators thinking about? A number of questions. Number one, which Greek New Testament text is the most accurate? We want the most accurate text. Which text is the most accurate? Is it the TR of the King James? Or the critical text that includes all of the scholarship of the last 400 years in its decisions? Because those are the two primary choices. All right? Virtually every Bible in English today is based either on Erasmus's work from the 16th century or the collective work of the 400 years since. That's it. Those are the two choices. Now, the Textus Receptus, that Erasmus is, will always have a greater number of will most often have a greater number of Greek manuscripts, but not the oldest. All right, and we've talked about the reasons for that. Remember, the Byzantines were making copies all the way until 1453. Nobody was making copies after the Muslims, or not nobody, almost nobody, after the Muslims invaded North Africa and Syria in the 8th century, the 7th and 8th century, right? And of course, in the West, they stopped and switched to Latin. So the majority is going to be what's represented from Byzantine. Are we just about counting? Or does older matter more than number? And that's a fluid conversation, and it's an important conversation, but that's what's being done by scholars. Second question for a translator is, do we want the most modern English that we can have, or do we want it in something traditional? That's a conversation to be had, right? Shakespeare is not easy to understand, right? I think everyone will admit to that. But do we want to modernize Shakespeare? Do we lose something when we modernize Shakespeare? Now, the King James and Shakespeare aren't exactly the same, but they have some of the same qualities. What's the value of that traditional language? It has some value. Does that value outweigh the accessibility of understanding it in a more modern translation? That's a conversation to be had. The New King James is a step in that direction by saying we like the tradition of the King James, but we got to update the language a little bit, help people understand it, right? Third, what is more important? Formal equivalency. In other words, trying to be, and I put it in air quotes because Kathy knows I hate using the word literal because it's almost literally not the right word most of the time. Formal equivalency. Right? Saying this is the Greek word and that's the English that goes with it. These two are equal. Or are we doing something that's dynamic or functional? Are we trying to convey meaning? I know those are the Greek words, but what did Paul mean and how do I put that into English? Literalisms, because of course, you know, our language and every language is full of idioms, right? Things that don't make sense if you translate them literally. And I ran into that when I was in Guatemala trying to preach through a translator, and she looked at me and said, "I can't say that in Spanish." And I said, "Why not? I said it in English, say it in Spanish." She said, that phrase doesn't make any sense in Spanish, so you have to rewrite that. What were you trying to say? And we worked our way through it, but it was an eye-opener to me because I'm thinking, translate. The arrogance of youth. No translation, and I'll show you an example later that is a perfect one. No translation's entirely one or the other. In some cases, the King James is very dynamic and not nearly as literal as some people think it is. And sometimes the New Living Translation, which has a well-earned reputation for being more of a paraphrase, can be surprisingly formal in the choices that it makes. None of them are set in stone that way. All right? They lean one way or another, but not on every phrase and not on every word. So eventually, we start getting new translations. I'm not trying to get us to understand all of these, but just to see the flow. In 1885, we get a new translation. And they always translated each Greek word with the same English word. As Charles Spurgeon said, that's great for English, but it's not, or for Greek, but it's not good for English, because it's not going to read well. It's going to be clunky. And then you have other ones coming out, notably the NIV in 1978. That's the most popular English translation in the world today. The New King James in 82, the New Living in 96, and then the ESV in 2001. Those are the primary translations that people are using. There are many. I want to show you this chart because it might help understand this. I don't agree with where he put all of these on here, but it gives us a good feel. All right? From word for word to paraphrase on the other end of this continuum, right? A word-for-word transliteration doesn't take into interlinear kind of thing, doesn't take into effect, into question the conventions of English. It's just trying to give you Greek words to English words. It's very clunky. Nobody does that. The closest common translation to that is the NASB. The New American Standard Bible will be that the words you choose here are important. Faithful is not the best word. More connected to the Greek and less connected to the English that you're trying to put it into. And then the King James is over on that end as well, as is the ESV. So there are common ideas about translation between the NASB, the King James, and the ESV. And then over towards the middle, which is not word for word, not a paraphrase. It's in the middle. They're trying to be thought for thought. That would be the NIV. They're standing in the middle. And you get a little bit more towards paraphrase. You get the New Living, the Good News, etc. The Message, they've got way over there because, of course, they're just saying, I'll give you, what we think is going on here. We're not worried about the actual Greek words that much. These are translational theories and thoughts and questions. None of this is right versus wrong. This is about what's better, about what's best, what's most useful, what's most helpful for discipleship and gospel presentation and all of that stuff. And so you have a continuum, again, not in every verse, but overall that you would look for. So if you want something that is more in tuned to the Greek and less worrying about English, you can find that. If you want something that focuses on readability and understandability in English, you can find that. And my advice, and if people were to ask me, would be a Christian who's going to study the Scriptures on a regular basis should probably have more than one. Not of the same, but of different translation. So when you get to a spot that you don't know what's going on, you're like, I don't get this verse, what is he talking about? Flip open another one. What's the NASB? What's the ESV say? And you don't actually have to physically own them. You can go to BibleGateway.com or another number of other websites. There's a fascinating thing they have on there. You can type in John 3:16, and then after you click it in one translation, put in all English translations, and like 60 different ones will show up. And you can just scan down all of them and see what choice everybody made with it. And maybe that will help you understand the part that you're struggling with. It's not all in the translation. Obviously, there's more than the words on the page to interpretation, the depth of understanding that we need there. But thoughts, comments about the modern translations. After this, we're talking about the actual text itself. I've got a bunch of examples that I think will help us understand looking at verses of Scripture. Yes? I do not. So that's not one that I am aware of. There are so many of them out there right now. There's about 8 or so that are major, and then there's another 40 or so that are not that well known. Again, an eclectic approach is very useful in that respect. And of course, those tools online are so available now that you can simply just look. Now, in some verses, the one that you got right in front of you will convey the meaning just fine. You might read a whole chapter and not run into something. But in some of Paul, and in some of the hard, difficult things, you might say, you know what, I'd kind of like to see what somebody else has to say. Any other thoughts regarding different translations? So again, the King James book writer, right, said the biggest difference now is in the translation style. So the translation style over here versus over here is going to affect what you're seeing in English more than that Greek. 9 times out of 10. And I use 9 times out of 10 not to be literal, but to say almost all the time. All right. So we are in the home stretch, and I actually think this is some of the most interesting material because we are going to look at some text. Before we look at individual verses in different translations, we got to talk about the 2 big variants. Most of the variants are small. They're a word, a phrase, a spelling of a word, right? They're not a big difference. These are 2 huge textual variants that affect our understanding, and they both happen in the Gospels. The first is what's known as the long ending of Mark 16:9 to 20. It's the longest variant in the New Testament, and it's in almost every New Testament manuscript. And by almost every, I mean all but Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, and one that is known as manuscript 304. So there's, of thousands, it's not in 3. So that's 99.9 something, right? Have the long ending of Mark. And you're thinking, how can it be a variant if that we are talking about when it's like that? Well, there's some good reasons. Number one, some of the manuscripts that have it have an asterisk or some other notation in the margin that the copyist put when he got to this part. Why did he do that? Why is he putting an asterisk at verse, well, of course, they didn't have the verse divisions back then, right? But when we get to where verse 9 is, why did he put a note in the margin? What was up with that? All right. And some of them have a shorter version of this same ending. So they have it, but not all of it. The biggest reason why we have questions about this is because it's a weird passage. Jesus appears to his disciples in a quote-unquote different form in verse 12. What on earth is that all about? What form is a different form? It's confusing. That's the only place in a post-resurrection experience where we hear that. He yells basically at the disciples in verse 14. He seems to strongly connect baptism to salvation in verse 16. And then the coup de grace, the thing that really scratches heads, is him talking about drinking poison and picking up snakes and all that stuff, right? So the ending of Mark is odd. And maybe it is just odd, but that leaves question marks. It's not in two of our oldest manuscripts in Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. So this has questions. The conclusion, the most likely scholarly conclusion, is that it is authentic. But we should note that it's odd, and we're not 100% sure on that. So read it, study it, but don't use it as the sole basis for picking up snakes or drinking poison, right? That kind of thing. So that is an interesting one. And then the next one is John 7:53 to 8:11, known as the Pericope de Adultura, the episode of adultery. And it's not in a whole bunch of different manuscripts, including some of those oldest papyri, P66 and P75. It's not in Sinaiticus. It's not in Vaticanus. It's not in most of the lectionaries, most of the Latin, most of the Syrian. You're thinking, well, if it's not in a lot of things, why is it still in our Bible? Fascinating conversation. Of those that contain it, some of them have it at 736, some at 744, some at 2125, and one has it in Luke after Luke 21:38. He didn't even have it in the Gospel of John. He put it in the Gospel of Luke. So that makes the scholars think the copyists knew that in their minds that it was in John somewhere. They just weren't sure where. So they just put it somewhere, which is an odd thing to be doing about an entire episode. So since the evidence is weak, why didn't they take it out? Right? Well, good. For one thing, the story of the woman caught in adultery, to put it mildly, it preaches. Right? There are all sorts of Jesus-like lessons to be learned from the woman caught in adultery about self-righteousness and forgiveness. I mean, it's awesome. If you can't preach that, you retire because it's easy. There's so much to say. You could preach it 6 different times emphasizing different things. So what's the conclusion? Well, the evidence tells us that it's likely not part of John's original gospel. What we think that it is an oral tradition about Jesus that later copyists were trying to figure out where it fit in the Gospel of John. Because they were sure that it belonged there, they just didn't know where or how. But nobody has taken it out from their published translation because you absolutely know what would happen in the Twitter world, right? You come out with the new NIV that doesn't have the woman caught in adultery. How's that going to go on social media? Right? It's not going to go well. We've sort of passed the point of no return with the social media age. It's not going to happen. It's never going to get taken out. Never is a long time. But so a lot of translations now have it in brackets or in italics or something like that. And that is a fascinating conversation all about itself because we know there were many oral traditions about Jesus that didn't get written down, right? People that were eyewitnesses and people that told stories about what he did. The Gospels don't contain it all, that's for sure. The man was ministering publicly for more than 3 years. So we know that there's more. This may be one of those oral traditions that actually did get written down, just not by John. So again, leave it in, but then take it that way. Now, is there anything in the gospel, in this passage, that you can't find Jesus saying somewhere else? No, right? You can't get that specific beautiful incident where these jerks are walking away and Jesus is like, nah, right? I wrote in the sand and you had to walk away. You can't get that lovely moment, but the theology is everywhere in the Gospels. So just be aware of those. Conversations are ongoing about those 2 passages. They are by far the longest variants, one with very strong textual history, but very weird theology, one with very, very weak textual history, but very strong theology. Weigh that. All right. Questions on either of those? Let's take a look at some translations. And I put it in different colors to help. Do we need to flick the light so you can see it better, or can you see? You good? All right. So one of the things I want to show you is that sometimes all of these different translations are virtually the same. This is Romans 6:23. I know you know it. Beginning in the King James Version, for the wages of sin is death, but the gift of God is eternal life through Jesus Christ our Lord. If you compare that to the NIV, the only difference is through becomes in, but there is a footnote or through. That's not because the Greek is different. That's because the preposition in Greek, dia, can mean in or through, depending on the context. And so which one does Paul mean here? Because they're both theologically true. Our salvation is through Jesus. Our salvation is in Jesus. Either one's fine by me. They both are true. So you've got a very slight difference, and so we see through, and then in. That's almost nothing, right? The only other difference between all of these different translations is that three different ones, the American Standard, the New American Standard, and the New Living, right, have added free. It's not in the Greek. There is no equivalent Greek word that is being translated as free there. So what are they doing? They're not translating a word to give us free. What are they translating? The thought. Because the gift that Paul is talking about is free. And he makes that point clear in Romans and Ephesians and Galatians and everywhere, right? So it definitely is a free gift. He didn't literally say that here, but was he implying it? Did he mean that? And sometimes the translators are saying, this will help people understand what Paul is trying to say, rather than what he actually literally said. And so there's some give and take on that. The New American Standard usually is much closer and doesn't do that kind of thing, but boom, they added free there. All right? And so you see that sometimes the verses are almost exactly the same. All right? Three of the, and these are just, a handful that I picked. Of course, there are dozens of translations. I couldn't put them all on the screen. A few of them decided that the word free there would help you understand it, and the rest of them are, the only difference is whether or not it was in or through. And both are perfectly acceptable as a translation. So let's go outside the box on this one. 1 John 5, 7, and 8. This is a significant variant. You see that these two have a lot more words than these two. What's going on here? 1 John 5, 7 to 8 is a famous Erasmus question. Remember good old Desiderius Erasmus? When Desiderius Erasmus published his first edition, it did not have the Greek words that the King James and the New King James are using here. And people were ticked because the Latin of Jerome had that. But when he looked at it, he said, I don't have it in any of the Greek manuscripts in front of me, so how can I put it there? And he said, basically, show me a Greek manuscript that has those words, and I'll put it in my next edition. And someone brought him a 15th century manuscript from, I think it was Ireland, that had that in it. One whose ink was barely dry. In other words, to say, now you have to put it back in. And so he put it back in the subsequent editions, and it eventually ends up in the King James because those subsequent editions were published by the time the King James comes into play. However, notice that the New King James puts a text footnote. The Nestle-Aland text and the majority text. So both the modern critical text and the majority omit the words, and again, we'll talk about the theology in a minute. Only 4 or 5 very late manuscripts contain these words in Greek. Yeah, none of them from before Erasmus's lifetime. It's not in any of those older manuscripts. It's in the Latin. And somehow it got in the Latin. That's an interesting side question. But it's not in the Greek from Byzantium. It wasn't in the Greek that Erasmus had. This is very clearly not original, but it came into the story at some point. The New American Standard leaves it out and then tells you what they left out and just says late manuscripts add. That's not a lot of information. And then the NIV has the same thing, but it has a better explanation. Not found in any Greek manuscript before the 14th century. No manuscript before the 14th century in Greek has it. How could it be original if it's not in any of those manuscripts before the 14th century? Something happened there, right? Somehow it got into the Latin and was added. Now, look at the statement. There are three that bear record in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost. These three are one. There are three that bear witness on earth. That is the most succinct and plain and obvious Trinitarian statement you could ask for in the New Testament. There is no issue at all with that theology. The only issue is John didn't write it. Somebody added it to the Latin text later, which found its way back into the Erasmus, which found its way into the King James. No issue with the statement. It's entirely orthodox and perfectly legit. It's just John didn't write it. It was probably added later during the arguments and the debates in the Latin about the Trinity, which of course there were many in those generations of the church. So, questions on that. This is one people like to argue about, to say, see, the modern translations are taking out the Trinity. Again, the Trinity is everywhere in the Gospel of John. The Trinity is all over Paul's writings. It's everywhere. It doesn't have to be spelled out like this to be in the text. And if you were trying to take the Trinity out, you would have to do a lot more surgery than just taking out that. But again, it's not original, and that's what we want, right? And these are two different ways of respecting that people are expecting to see it there if they grew up on the King James, and now looking at the footnote, they can see why it's not, rather than just taking it out and leaving people wondering. The other issue, of course, is that the numbers on the verses were added based on the text that the King James is using, right? So every once in a while in a modern eclectic text, you've got a number with no verse there, because the part that was taken out was an addition. Questions on the Johannine comma, as it's called. Now look at this one. This is an example of one of the things that happens in the manuscripts that we were talking about before. Mark 10:21, I just picked two of them because it illustrates this. They're basically the same until the very end. Take up the cross and follow me, versus then come follow me. And if you wanted to be uncharitable, you could say, see, the NIV doesn't want you to take up the cross. The NIV doesn't want real discipleship. But if you were looking at it, you would realize that the NIV has that exact same phrase in Matthew 16:24, Luke 9:23, Mark 3:34, and just not Mark 10:21. So what happened was that the copyist added it because he was familiar with the other times that Jesus said, take up the cross and follow me, but Mark didn't write it this time. It's not in Sinaiticus, it's not in Vaticanus, but of course Erasmus didn't know that, and so he didn't understand it. It's harmonization. Copyists do this. Because they read a verse and that they're writing down and they know in their head what they think it says. But remember, Jesus spoke publicly again and again and again and again. His phraseology is not 100% the same all the time. And so we should expect slight variations from one moment to the next, right? 6 months later in a different part of the country, he's talking about the same topic. If he uses slightly different phrasing, that's expected. But our tendency, or the tendency of our ancestors in the faith who were copying, would be to harmonize and to make them sound the same. Again, if you want to read Jesus say, "Take up the cross and follow me" in a modern translation, you got 3 other places to look. And one of them is in the Gospel of Mark, just not this one as well. Does that make sense? And here is a famous one, and this is not based on Greek in any way, shape, or form. It's not even based on translations. John 1:1, fairly famous. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Notice the King James the ESV, and the Catholic Bible are the same. There's virtually no difference, right? They're the same. So why bring it up? Well, I bring it up because the New World Translation, the guys that knock on your door and as the Jehovah's Witness, says, "In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was a God, smaller g." Now, we talked about this before. The original Greek doesn't have punctuation. The original Greek doesn't have lowercase and uppercase for proper nouns. So this G, the capitals there, are a translator's choice because they think that John was talking about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and so we capitalize it, right? But we don't know that without context because it's not the way it was copied. It was all block letters, all capitals, so you can't have that. So this is an interesting choice, but this is where it is. There is no Greek manuscript that has an indefinite article before the word theos, before God, in the Greek. There is not a single one. There never has been one. There isn't one. So why is it there? Why did they put it there? They put it there because they're not Trinitarians. They don't believe that Jesus is God, so therefore the text has to be shaped to fit that. Now the fascinating thing is that if you look at the entirety of John 1, that's not changing the fact that John 1 is calling Jesus God. All right? You didn't stop that. This is the most obvious one, but the entirety of the chapter practically is about how Jesus was eternally begotten of the Father, how he's one in being with the Father. I mean, my goodness, read the Gospel of John. It's everywhere in the Gospel of John. This isn't fixing it if you don't believe that Jesus is God. But that's a change. There's another change like that in Colossians where they add the word other in front of things. All other things were made by him. They do that like 5 times in Colossians as well. But this is not a question of the Greek. This is not a question of translational grammatical mumbo-jumbo. This is theology determining translation. And that's dangerous whenever it happens. This just happens to be a very obvious example and a very dangerous example. But we don't want theology determining translations. If you have any questions on any of these, stop me. There's another 6 more to go, and then we'll be done a little bit early. Psalm 8:5. This is a translational difference. Thou hast made him a little lower than the angels. And the NIV says angels. The King James and the NIV are together. The New Living says you've made him a little lower than God. Well, God and the angels are not the same thing. How could we be so far apart? What's going on here? The ESV splits the baby and calls it heavenly beings. And then the ERV calls them like gods with a small g. Those are 4 different things. Is it the gods, small g? Is it heavenly beings? Is it God in heaven? Or is it the angels? Which one is it? The explanation for why we can have such divergence is quite fascinating. Because the Hebrew word Elohim means all of those things in the Hebrew text, depending on the context. When they're talking about the gods of the Amorites, it's Elohim. When you're talking about the angel that spoke to Abraham, it's Elohim. All right? When you're talking about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, it's Elohim. All of those are the same Hebrew word. It's a word with a large range of meaning. But what does the psalmist mean? Which one of those things is humanity a little bit lower than? All of them, right? We're, in a sense, lower than any heavenly being. In a sense, lower than the angels. Not quite the same sense as that we're lower than God, but we're still lower. So which one is it? It's entirely a contextual translation kind of question. Now, there's an added wrinkle, because the Septuagint, that Greek translation from the 2nd century BC, uses a word that we know. It uses the Greek angelos, angels. The Greek is more specific. Does that mean that we in English should say angels because the Jews in Alexandria in the 2nd century translated it as angels? Do we have to follow their lead? It's a great question. Hebrews 2:7, when it quotes this, quotes the Septuagint and uses angelos. So do we have to translate Psalm 8:5 the same way that the writer of Hebrews quotes it? Those are fascinating conversations about how the text is related to itself. And ultimately the question, while fascinating, how much of an effect on this verse do we have? Not much, because the psalmist is trying to remind us that we're not gods, right? And of course, on this, he says, and yet you crowned him with glory and honor. So it's a contrast between our mortal state and God's care for us. So you don't lose the contrast no matter which way it's translated. But I think that's fascinating that we've got the Septuagint and Hebrews 2:7 quoting it one way. Whether that should be definitive and normative for Psalm 8:5 is an interesting question. 1 Timothy 6:10. Here is an interesting way of trying to understand the Greek because it doesn't make sense in English. You know this. The desire of money is the root of all evil, right? The root of all evil. We all know that phrase, the root of all evil, about money. But the Greek doesn't say the root of all evil. It says a root of all the evils. But a root of the evils doesn't sound good in English. Doesn't make sense. That's not how we speak, right? We don't say that something is a root of all the evils with the indefinite article under root and it being, and then the evils. So we don't do that in English. So how do you make that English without changing what Paul was trying to tell Timothy? And you see the variety of choices, right? The Geneva Bible makes it the root. Not a root, not one of the roots, but the root. That's different. The Geneva went that way, the King James went that way, and fascinatingly, the New Living Translation goes that way. They all call it the root, whereas the NASB and the NIV call it a root. There's a slightly different understanding to that. And then, of course, we've got all evil, all sorts of evil, all kinds of evil, and all kinds of evil. Because it says a root of all the evils, not all evil, as in sorts of evils and kinds of evils and types of evils. Money is at the root of many of that, right? We know what he's trying to say. It's hard to put it into English in one neat phrase. And you can see the differences, not because anybody's looking at different Greek, but because they're trying to, it's a particular phrase in Greek that we struggle in English to use. Does that make sense? Anybody got, and then we have got some footnotes, right? Footnotes, literally, the evils. That helps. And I left that up there just for interesting. That's the Geneva Bible with one of those footnotes, those Calvinist footnotes for you. All right, that's just one example. Sorrow and grief do as it were pierce through the mind of man and are the harvest and true fruits of covetousness. In case you were wondering, just some FYI from good old Calvin or one of his buddies. 2 Timothy 2:15, the Owanaki verse. I grew up memorizing this verse in the children's program that I was a part of. Again, it's not about the Greek here. It's about how do we put this into English. Study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. That was the original King James that I memorized as a kid. Very similar to the Geneva, but of course the Geneva gives you a nice long footnote with a whole bunch of stuff. The New American Standard said, you know what? Study doesn't mean what it did back in the day. In the 17th century, the word study didn't mean what it means today. Why has it changed? Don't read my note. I put it at the bottom. Because we live in a world of public education. When the King James Bible was written, people were not studying on a regular basis because most people were illiterate. There was not public education yet. But today, every kid studies all the time. It's a very different word than it was then. It has a very academic quality to it. But was Paul talking about the academic study of Scripture, or did he mean something different? So it's not about the Greek, it's about the shifting of the English language in the 400 years. So we've got a variety. Be diligent, do your best, work hard, all trying to get to what Paul meant then versus what the word used to mean now in English. And then the second one is just a hard Greek word to find out, to put into English. Because what on earth does rightly dividing mean? Does that mean figuring out where the verse divisions are supposed to go? Where the punctuation is supposed to? How do you rightly divide the Bible? That's just it's kind of clunky in English. And so we've got accurately handling, correctly explaining, people trying to do it. So this verse doesn't have, it's not so much about, it's not about the Greek, it's just trying to figure out how do we maintain what Paul was trying to get Timothy to do and not give a false impression about the Scriptures. I don't have any issue with the King James, but I like the fact that I understand the fact that we've got some difference of trying to understand his meaning, not just his words. Okay? Two more. 2 Timothy 3:16. We were just next door in 2 Timothy 2:15. This one is the one where the King James is not being literal. All Scripture is given by inspiration of God and is profitable for doctrine, reproof, correction, and instruction in righteousness. The only issue with that as a translation is that Paul did not use the word for inspiration. He used a very different word, and an interesting word. He actually used what we call a hapax legomena. This is the only time in surviving ancient Greek literature that these two words, it's a compound word, that Paul used, are ever used by anybody. Basically, Paul said, the word that I want is God and breathed, and that's not a word in Greek, so I'm just going to put them next to each other and make it the word God-breathed. So in Greek, it says, all Scripture is God-breathed. Okay? But what on earth is God-breathed, right? Paul, you just made a word up. Nobody else uses it. What are we supposed to do with that? So do we keep the metaphor in our translation? Do we keep it God-breathed and let people figure it out themselves? Or do we come up with what we think Paul meant, which is what the theology of the term inspiration means? Because inspiration is a theological term, not a metaphorical term like the one that Paul used. The King James and the New American Standard, who are normally much more literal than the other translations, they have a very free interpretation here, calling it inspiration. Whereas the NIV and the ESV have kept the metaphor. Which one should it be? Are we trying to keep Paul's words or Paul's meaning? Can we keep his meaning without the metaphor? Those are great questions. With me? Thoughts? Interesting, huh? So sometimes it's just, you gotta make choices. That's why we have translation committees. That's why this is a scholarly pursuit with some thought to it. Now, did you ask yourself, why does he keep giving us stuff from 1st and 2nd Timothy? I didn't randomly pick these. These are all interesting ones. Why are half of my examples from 1st and 2nd Timothy? It makes all the sense in the world. This is a new slide. You're the first people to ever see it. The topics covered by Paul in his pastoral letters, right, 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus, are interesting topics that are separate from his letters to churches, because in them he's mentoring people as leaders of the church. So he's talking about topics he doesn't talk about anywhere else, or nobody else talks about. These are the only times these topics are being talked about. And so he uses words that other New Testament authors don't use. And he uses words in the pastoral letters that he himself doesn't use elsewhere. Some of these words are not in Ephesians or Romans or Galatians. They're only in 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus, in the pastorals. So the text of the pastoral letters contains numerous Greek words that only appear in the New Testament one time, or at least only in the pastoral letters. I've been doing 1st, 2nd Timothy in my verse-by-verse Wednesday Bible study, and I've got a exegetical study that I use to prepare for it, and every time one of these happens, it notes it. FYI, that Greek word is only used once in the New Testament, and it happens again and again and again in this text. So we are naturally going to have more variety in our translations when the translators only have one example to work with. They can't compare it to how James used it or John used it or Luke used it. They've only got Paul, and they've only got Paul here talking about this one topic. And so there's going to be more leeway. And so you see this developing in the translations. Some areas are very similar because the phraseology and the words are very common and they're used a lot, right, in the Gospels and stuff. But some of this stuff, and Revelation's going to have that same issue, right? We're talking about topics in John's vision of the apocalypse that nobody else is talking about in Greek. And so we're going to get some interesting translational choices. So there's no conspiracy as to why there's more variety there. That's just the nature of the language and its usage. If we had 30 letters that Paul wrote to proteges that he was mentoring, we wouldn't have this issue because he would have been using it over and over and over again, and we'd see all the different variety. But we've only got a few. And then one last one. And sometimes it's not in the translation itself. It's just in the footnotes. And if you don't bother to go down to the bottom of the page and look at the footnotes, you wouldn't even notice it. This is, of course, famously Isaiah 7:14, right? The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and you'll call him Emmanuel, right? Extremely important verse for the gospel birth narratives. The question is, what did Isaiah mean in Isaiah's day? Because the Hebrew word can mean either virgin or young woman who is not a virgin but is still a young woman. There's some overlap in their words. So in other words, when Isaiah prophesied, was the woman he was talking about in his day a virgin or not? That is an open question in Isaiah's text. Now, when it's quoted in the New Testament, they clearly mean virgin. right? And the different Greek words help make that, but the context makes it quite obvious. And so in some of the footnotes, we recognize that. The New Living Translation gives you a footnote or young woman. The NIV gives you a footnote or young woman. The NASB gives you a footnote or maiden, whereas the New King James doesn't tell you about that. It's not a controversy. It's just a way to more closely look at Isaiah's text in Isaiah's day. Because normally when we read this, we're reading this about Jesus, right? We're not even stopping to think about Isaiah and who he's talking to. But this was a prophecy for Isaiah's day first, because it was assigned to a king in his lifetime. It later becomes a sign, of course, in the Gospels. And that's the last one. So now it's time for questions, thoughts, comments about the modern critical text, about modern translations, about the process that got us here, or anything in between that has to do with this topic.
What one do you use?
I preach from the NIV. I grew up with it, and it works best for me. But I make a specific habit of, we have an opening scripture every week, sort of a reflect that we start with. I rotate that through all of the major ones. Geneva, New King James, New Living, NASB, ESV. I rotate it through in order to remind the people of the congregation that I'm more than happy for them to read any kind. That's just my way of doing it. I know people that use different ones. I have no particular, I'm not married to it. It's what I am most familiar with. It's what I grew up studying. My earliest years would have been the King James, but my formative theological years would have been in the NIV. So that's what I've been using. And I switched to the new edition when it came out, which has some small changes from the previous edition. But I find value in all of them. Every once in a while, a different translation has a way of putting it that really speaks to the need. So, questions about the text, about where we're at? Does it make sense? Did I lose you somewhere?
This whole one right now with woman versus maiden versus virgin.
Yep.
Like, is it known how that was originally stated, or is that a variant?
No, it's not a variant. It's the Hebrew word. The Hebrew word has more range than just virgin. It can mean both of those things depending on the context. And the question is, the woman to be a sign in Isaiah's day doesn't have to be a miraculous conception, because he was telling the king, by the time this woman conceives, this thing's going to happen. In other words, it's coming soon. Whereas, of course, when the gospel writers look at Jesus' life, they say, Isaiah was saying more than he knew. So it's fine to leave it as virgin in the Hebrew. Whether or not it should be that one or the other doesn't make a big difference, because, of course, that wasn't the point of the sign. The point of the sign was for this guy to pay attention when Isaiah was talking. In the Greek, and when it's quoted in the New Testament, then obviously it's virgin. But some people would be afraid of that footnote, because they would think that brings the virgin birth into question. But it has nothing to do with it. All right, that again, that's not the way theology works. But people get, flustered by stuff, and that's okay. You just need to understand what's going on. So, other questions, other thoughts, other stuff before we wrap it up. We are ahead of the game with a few minutes to spare. All right. I appreciate you guys coming, and thank you for partaking of this, and hopefully it whets your appetite for further study of these issues. Reach out to me if you have any questions that come up later.
Thank you.
Yep.
You did a good job.
Oh, thanks.